Any research study requires that researchers protect the ethical principles of study participants. Two of the methods that are commonly used by researchers to do this are the use of a consent process, informed consent, and IRBs, which stands for institutional review boards. So we'll briefly review those two processes. As nurses, we're very familiar with the concept of informed consent. We do informed consent quite often before surgeries or before procedures that have inherent risks. So, therefore, this is very similar to the process of doing informed consent in a clinical setting. So, you see that people have to have adequate information in order to make a truly informed decision. So, they have to understand the purpose of the study, any risks and benefits, and exactly what the researchers expect for them to do as a product of their participation in the study. And that last bullet point is very important. We have to make the participants very clearly understand that they have the right to choose to participate or not to participate. And if they do decide to participate, they have the freedom to withdraw at any time during the process of the study without fear of penalty from the researcher. This is an example of an informed consent process. In most studies, an actual form is used for informed consent. Sometimes it's paper based. Sometimes, in the case of web studies, like through SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, computer-based survey processes will use a built-in informed consent online and just have them type in their name or click a button that says, I've read this information and I agree to the terms of this informed consent. There are two special types of consent that you see on the slide. We'll start with process first. Process consents are typically thought of in the realm of qualitative research. And the gist of that is that as qualitative researchers, we can kind of sometimes veer from our typical pattern. So I thought I was only going to interview you one time for my study. However, I realized after the first round of interviews, I don't quite have enough information. And I really wish I would have asked this other question. So I go back to my participants and I have to get them consented again for that second part of the interview. So, because qualitative studies often unfold in a less predictable pattern, we have process consents. And each new process of communication with a participant requires a second or third or fourth step of the consent process. Now, for implied consent, this is especially common in truly anonymous studies because if someone actually signs a consent form, I know that Jane Smith was in my study. Sometimes on online studies, instead of having them sign or acknowledge using their name, they'll just simply say, if you complete this survey, that means you consented to be in this study. So, kind of like by pressing submit, you're good. We don't need your name, we don't need signatures. It keeps everything anonymous, and that is okay, especially in online type surveys or surveys where you sit a stack of questionnaires in a nurse's station and people can add whenever they want, pick it up and fill it out. There's still no name connected to that, which is maintaining their privacy. A second step that pretty much every study you're going to read about has is institutional review board or some kind of external check and balance to make sure that the researchers have fully done everything they possibly could to protect the human rights of the participants in their studies. In the United States, we typically call them IRBs, institutional review boards. Most universities and many of the larger hospitals where research is conducted typically have their own in-house IRB process. So a researcher submits a really long application that fully details every decision that they plan to make and how they plan to protect the ethical participants, the ethical rights. And then the IRB reads over that with a fine-tooth comb to see what possibly could we do to even ramp up our protections. So we can't just go out and start getting people in our study and asking them for data until we receive external reviewer permission to do so. You'll see on the slide that sometimes in Canada specifically, they use the term research ethics boards. In other countries, you may see some deviant from that, but they may not all call them IRBs, but the process is still the same. That a group or a panel of experts, when it comes to research and ethics, has vetted that this is safe and this is an ethical study that may proceed into data collection and sampling. So when you're looking at a research article, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed method study, you're typically going to see the researchers talk about their ethical provisions in the method section. Like this snippet of an article, sometimes they'll have like a little subtitle like ethical considerations. That's nice because now I can clearly see, okay, this is what these researchers did. Now, this was a European study, so therefore they didn't use the words IRB, nor did they even talk about the Belmont Report. But that makes sense because the Belmont Report is a USA thing. It's not an internationally followed rules typically. Instead, they use the Declaration of Helsinki, which is an international ethics policy declaration. But they did talk about getting approval from this research ethics committee. And so that's basically what you're going to see. They're usually going to talk about informed consent and some kind of external review panel. This comes from two different studies. That last one was a pretty big paragraph. Look at this one. This is all this study talked about. The researchers simply put two sentences. We used informed consent. We had our IRB approval. That's all they told you. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad study. Depending on the journals that they're trying to publish in, sometimes the journals may not give them but so many words. And so when I have this many words, I can't use a lot of it for ethics. So by just simply stating that we did consent, we had IRB, that's enough. That's at minimum what you should see in an article when you're looking at it and critiquing whether the study was an ethically done study. This is a third article, and again, this is not in the United States, so you don't see the words IRB. Instead, it says ethical committee, same difference. And then they talked about the written consent, and then they specifically gave you a little bit more information, which I found was good because not all of their participants were able to give informed consent, possibly because of some cognitive or developmental issues that did not allow them to make informed decisions autonomously. And so they stated that instead, for those people who couldn't consent for whatever reason, that they received that consent from the principal caregiver, whoever was that power of attorney or spokesperson for the individual. And then they added an extra little blurb about how they kept the data secured. Sometimes you'll see that they store it in a password protected Excel file or in a locked filing cabinet. You don't always see that. But in this article, the researchers felt it important for you to know that. So again, anytime you read an article or about a study, whatever type of study it is, somewhere in the methods section, you should expect for them to address these issues. IRB, or External Review Committee panel, whatever they call it, and a consent process. Whether it was process consent, implied consent, or informed consent, one of those needs to be at work during this study and in the article. All right, thanks for watching.